Now that we've explained why the resurrection of Jesus is so important, detailed how to best go about researching its historical authenticity, and broken down all the most popular theories explaining the empty tomb, it's time for us to actually begin examining the evidence itself. If we want to know what happened on Easter morning, it's absolutely necessary for us to figure out what we can, with the utmost confidence, conclude happened on that day and the days leading up to it some 2,000 years ago. If you, like me, are a Christian, our natural temptation is to flip open to the four Gospels and immediately accept everything within them as undeniable truth. However, I must remind you that the goal of this study is not merely to defend what we already believe, but to pursue truth. As such, we can't presuppose that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the inspired, authoritative Word of God. Instead, for the sake of our study, we have to treat them as nothing more than early historical documents testifying to the life of Jesus. In the same way, a skeptic can't disregard the four Gospels all because they have an obvious pro-Christian agenda. Instead, all of us, religious or secular, believer or skeptic, have to examine all the historical witnesses in as unbiased a manner as possible to try and determine what we can actually know about the historical Jesus. We need to examine the evidence, establish a historical bedrock, and seek to answer the following question. From a strictly historical perspective, what can we know about the supposed death and resurrection of Jesus? Then and only then can we return to our theories that we've already discussed to determine what hypothesis best accounts for the historical bedrock. And the good news is that, apart from some fringe internet skeptics, it is almost universally acknowledged amongst historians and scholars that Jesus of Nazareth was a real person who lived and died 2,000 years ago. The better news is that, for the sake of our study, we needn't bother ourselves with scrutinizing every single detail of Jesus' life. For as interesting as it would be to examine the validity of his birthplace or his other miracles, the historical inquiry that we are chiefly focused on in this study is concerned with his resurrection, namely, whether or not it actually happened. As such, we can limit our focus to the events which took place from the day Jesus reportedly died to the aftermath of his supposed resurrection, because that is what is most important to our present study. This limits our area of focus immensely and allows us to cut straight to the chase. It only follows then that the first question that we have to answer is this: how do we know that Jesus was actually crucified? After all, it's kind of hard to resurrect from the dead if you were never dead to begin with, and some of the theories that we've mentioned are built on the presupposition that Jesus did not die. As such, the very first thing that we need to address before examining anything else in this study is the matter of Christ's crucifixion. How do we know that Jesus was crucified? And assuming that he was crucified, how do we know that he died on the cross? These are the questions that we are going to begin answering right now. And right off the bat, I've got even more good news for you, because the death of Jesus, specifically his death by crucifixion, is one of the facts of history which we can number amongst the historical bedrock. In other words, it is nearly universally acknowledged amongst historians, religious and secular alike, that Jesus of Nazareth suffered a death by crucifixion at the hands of Pontius Pilate sometime between the years of 30 CE and 33 CE. However, I don't want you to just take my word for it, and I'm never going to want you to just take my word for it throughout the study. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to dive deep and look at the evidence itself so that you're not just trusting me, but you have seen it yourself. The goal of this whole series is to help you see the evidence to examine it for yourself, so we're going to dive deep into the historical evidence to determine why the death of Jesus is a matter of historical bedrock. And as it stands, there are four chief evidences which point us to this undeniable conclusion, each of which I will briefly summarize before we examine them more thoroughly one at a time. The first piece of evidence confirming the crucifixion of Jesus is what we can call multiple attestation. In other words, the sheer number of ancient records from Christian and non-Christian sources alike attesting to Jesus' death by crucifixion is sufficient to give us reason for confidence that he did in fact die upon the cross. To put it simply, we have a high quantity of historical witnesses which attest to his crucifixion. The second piece of evidence is what we can call early attestation. Not only do we have a high quantity of historical witnesses attesting to Christ's crucifixion, but we have reason to believe that these sources can be deemed higher in quality, as many of them were written very shortly after the event itself, which leaves less room for legendary expansion, myth-making, or conspiracy. While we have many ancient records attesting to Christ's death in the subsequent centuries, many of the historical witnesses date to within decades or even years of the event itself, as we will see. The third piece of evidence is credible attestation. This, like the previous piece of evidence, addresses the quality of the historical accounts themselves. When you examine some of our earliest historical witnesses, there are certain details found within those accounts which carry qualities which incline historians to favor them as being authentic reports documenting genuine historical truth. In other words, the accounts do not bear marks of fabrication, but from all historical analysis can be viewed as highly credible. The fourth and final piece of evidence is the probability of surviving crucifixion. To put it quite simply, the odds aren't in your favor. Assuming that the first three pieces of evidence can undeniably prove that Jesus was crucified, this final piece of evidence examines the scientific probability of surviving a crucifixion such as that which Jesus endured, and it demonstrates the extremely low, borderline non-existent chances a person had of surviving such an experience and death sentence. In the end, when all these things are considered, we have good reason for confidently saying that Jesus died a death by crucifixion. But like I said, don't take my word for it. Let's examine the evidence itself. As Mike Licona points out, the first evidence of Jesus' death by crucifixion is that Jesus' death by crucifixion is multiply attested by a fair number of ancient sources, Christian and non-Christian alike. Since much of this study is largely indebted to Licona's work and the resources and footnotes provided in that work, I will try to quote from him as much as possible to give credit where credit is due, lest you think that I magically came up with all of this information all on my own. While the things that we're discussing are a blend of my own research and other people's research, I can't emphasize how useful his book was in instructing and organizing the flow of this historical inquiry as we're approaching it in this study. As Licona points out, the death of Jesus isn't merely attested to by Christian sources. Rather, it is mentioned by non-Christian sources as well, which is significant not merely because they are non-Christian sources, but because, as non-Christians, they do not believe in the resurrection and hence have no reason for presenting Jesus as crucified unless they genuinely believed him to be so. As such, we will begin examining some of these sources. First up is none other than Flavius Josephus, the first century Jewish historian renowned for documenting the history of the Jewish people from their origins all the way to the First Jewish-Roman War, in which he served as a Jewish general before fully defecting to the Romans and becoming an advisor to the emperor. In his work Antiquities of the Jews, written in 94 CE, the 13th year of the Emperor Domitian, Josephus provides a plethora of information about the socio-political climate of first century Judea. In the context of discussing Pontius Pilate's time as prefect of Judea, Josephus records the following, generally known as the Testimonium Flavianum. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day. Given the fact that Josephus was not a Christian, some scholars have questioned the authenticity of this account, since Josephus appears to explicitly call Jesus the Christ and say that he did resurrect from the dead as prophesied by the scriptures. However, it is generally accepted that most of the text is original to Josephus, and some scholars, such as T.C. Schmidt, argue that questions of inauthenticity might stem from misunderstandings of the text itself, not from it actually being unoriginal to Josephus. More relevant to our point, however, is that Josephus, in a portion of the text that is almost universally acknowledged as being authentic, attests to the fact that Jesus was condemned to the cross during the days of Pontius Pilate. This is significant not only because it aligns with scripture, but because Josephus, being a non-Christian Jew with Roman allegiances, had no evident motive for aligning his narrative with that of the Christians. As such, his only reasons for reporting that Jesus was crucified during the time of Pilate were because he believed it to be true, and because he believed this to be a detail significant enough to merit being mentioned in a history of the Jewish people. Thus, in Josephus, we have at least one non-Christian attestation, not only to the crucifixion of Christ, but specifically his crucifixion during the time of Pontius Pilate. And since history attests to the fact that Pilate was in charge of Judea from 26 to 36 CE, this also allows us to narrow the date of Jesus' crucifixion to falling somewhere between that range. Next up is Tacitus, the early 2nd century Roman who goes down in history as one of the greatest Roman historians to have ever lived, praised for his accuracy and his ability to accurately describe in detail places that he'd never even been to and events that he'd never even seen. The Oxford Companion to Classical Literature mentions how Tacitus's annals in particular show Tacitus to have been one of the greatest of historians, with a penetrating insight into character and a sober grasp of the significant issues of the time. In Book 15 of said annals, Tacitus writes about the Great Fire of Rome of July 64 CE, mentioning how the Emperor Nero started the fire only to later blame Christians. He says the following: "But all human efforts, all the lavish gifts of the emperor, and the propitiations of the gods did not banish the sinister belief that the conflagration was the result of an order. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular." This report is arguably even more significant than that of Josephus because Tacitus has a very clear anti-Christian bias, referring to Christians as a most mischievous superstition and a class hated for their abominations. Therefore, we can know with absolute certainty that this report is not being affected by some pro-Christian agenda when he reports that Jesus suffered the extreme penalty, a polite reference to crucifixion, during the reign of Tiberius at the hand of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. This lines up well with Josephus' account, with the added detail that this was during the reign of Tiberius, who we know reigned from 14 to 37 CE. Tacitus also mentions that the Jesus movement began in Judea before spreading all the way to Rome, which aligns well with the history recounted in the Bible, most relevant to our present discussion being the fact that Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem, a city in the province of Judea. But it doesn't stop there. Next up is Lucian, a 2nd century Syrian rhetorician known for his tongue-in-cheek pamphlets. In his satirical work, The Passing of Peregrinus, Lucian presents the Cynic philosopher Peregrinus Proteus as taking advantage of Christian generosity before burning himself at the stake during the Olympic Games of 165 CE, a fictional retelling of a story partially rooted in historical truth. Near the beginning of this satire, Lucian details how, after being exposed for a series of misdeeds, Peregrinus exiled himself to the land of Palestine. It was then that he learned the wondrous lore of the Christians by associating with their priests and scribes in Palestine. And how else could it be? In a trice, he made them all look like children, for he was prophet, cult leader, head of the synagogue, and everything all by himself. He interpreted and explained some of their books and even composed many, and they revered him as a god, made use of him as a lawgiver, and set him down as a protector. Next after that other, to be sure, whom they still worship, the man who was crucified in Palestine because he introduced the new cult into the world. You can tell by Lucian's flippant attitude that he has no respect for Christians. No sooner has Peregrinus arrived in their midst than they are tricked into deeming him as a prophet, cult leader, and head of the synagogue, with some revering him to the status of a god, according to Lucian. You can tell that Lucian views Christians as being very gullible and foolish, which indicates to us once again that he has no pro-Christian agenda. This is why it's significant when, towards the end of this quote, Lucian mockingly says that Christians began to exalt Peregrinus in the same way that they exalted that other whom they still worship, the man who was crucified in Palestine because he introduced this new cult into the world. This is an obvious reference to Jesus, who Lucian attests to being crucified in Palestine. About 30 years before Lucian penned this satire, the Roman Emperor Hadrian renamed the province of Judea to Palestine after suppressing the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 CE, with the term Palestine, derived from the word Philistine, intended to sever the connection between the Jewish people and their homeland. As such, when Lucian says that Jesus was crucified in Palestine, this is his way of saying that Jesus was crucified in Judea, which is consistent with the testimony of Tacitus. Yet this isn't all that Lucian has to say. A short while later, he proceeds to say the following about the Christians. Furthermore, their first lawgiver, by which he means Jesus, persuaded them that they are all brothers of one another after they have transgressed once. For all by denying the Greek gods and by worshipping that crucified sophist himself and living under his laws. Therefore they despise all things indiscriminately and consider them common property, receiving such doctrines traditionally without any definite evidence. So if any charlatan and trickster able to profit by occasions comes among them, he quickly acquires sudden wealth by imposing upon simple folk. Here once again, Lucian makes his disdain for Christians evident by characterizing them as dunderheads who are easy prey for charlatans or tricksters who are wanting to make some quick wealth by manipulating the simple-minded. This reinforces the fact that he does not have a pro-Christian bias. However, at the very same time, he asserts that the defining features of the Christian cult are that, on one hand, they denied all the Greek gods, while on the other hand, they worshipped that crucified sophist himself and lived under his laws. While this isn't necessarily relevant to our present inquiry, it is evident that the earliest Christians worshipped Jesus as God, since Lucian says that their worship of Jesus demanded them rejecting the entire Greek pantheon. More relevant to our discussion, however, is the way that he mockingly characterizes Jesus as a crucified sophist. This title is evidently meant to be an indictment on the Christian religion, Lucian's way of mocking the fact that the wise leader that they worship was so sophisticated in his wisdom that he earned himself the most embarrassing and humiliating, shameful death imaginable, death by crucifixion. It's his way of calling Jesus a fool. At the same time, in the midst of his insult, he gives us yet another attestation that it was generally agreed upon that whoever the leader of the Christian movement was, it was well known that he had suffered a death by crucifixion down in Palestine, and moreover, that his followers were mocked for willingly worshipping such a person. Next up is Mara bar Serapion, a Syrian Stoic philosopher whose one lasting contribution to the annals of human history was a letter that he wrote to his son, Serapion. While the letter can be dated anywhere between 73 CE and the 3rd century, details within the letter itself have led most scholars to hold that it was composed during or shortly after 73 CE, in which case this is the earliest witness that we've examined so far. The author is writing from prison, having been taken prisoner by the Romans who destroyed his city. He writes to his son in light of these events to encourage him to continue pursuing the path of wisdom, explaining that wisdom ultimately triumphs over folly and that God punishes those who afflict the wise. This is what he says. What are we to say when the wise are dragged by force by the hands of tyrants, and their wisdom is deprived of its freedom by slander, and they are plundered for their superior intelligence without the opportunity of making a defense? They are not wholly to be pitied. For what benefit did the Athenians obtain by putting Socrates to death, seeing that they received as retribution for it famine and pestilence? Or the people of Samos by the burning of Pythagoras, seeing that in 1 hour the whole of their country was covered with sand? Or the Jews by the murder of their wise king, seeing that from that very time their kingdom was driven away from them? For with justice did God grant a recompense to the wisdom of all three of them. The author cites 3 examples to prove his point: Socrates, Pythagoras, and the unnamed wise king of the Jews. In each of these examples, a wise man was killed by foolish, evil men, only to be vindicated by sudden judgment that came down upon their oppressors. Socrates was forced to drink poison, and Athens was judged. Pythagoras was burned, and Samos was judged. The wise king of the Jews was murdered, and from that very time their kingdom was driven away from them. Given that Pythagoras lived in the 6th century BCE and Socrates lived in the 5th century BCE, this last event would have easily been the freshest on the author's mind because Judea was only destroyed by the Romans 3 years earlier in 70 CE. He does not identify the wise king of the Jews by name, and so we can't say with 100% confidence that he is referring to Jesus, but as of yet, there are no serious alternative candidates who would fit the description, so this is why virtually all historians, Christians, Jewish, and secular alike, would identify this as being a reference to Jesus of Nazareth, who would have been crucified around 40 years prior to the destruction event which Mara is describing. This is significant for several reasons. For one, we have no reason to believe that the author was himself a Christian, as he makes no reference to a supposed resurrection, nor does he reference the Christian movement at all. Instead, he refers to Jesus in reference to the Jewish people as a whole, calling him their wise king, which tells us that he wasn't Jewish either. He is simply an outsider citing an example to prove his point about wisdom being vindicated. Secondly, it confirms to us that Jesus was a Jew, that he was regarded as a wise man, and that he was regarded by some as a king, that he was executed unjustly, that his execution was followed by the laws of Jewish national sovereignty, and that, even within years of Jerusalem falling, the fall of Judea was in some way being associated with the Jewish people's murder of their so-called wise king. That's a lot of information. This tells us that, from very early on, even non-Jewish people heard rumors that the fall of Jerusalem was direct judgment for what they had done to Jesus. A rumor so widespread that the author didn't feel the need to explain what he meant to his son, presupposing that he was already familiar with this example. Not only does this serve the purpose of emphasizing Jesus' popularity and significance, but it also reflects Jesus' own prophecies of the coming judgment and reflects early Christian interpretation of what happened in 70 CE. This is all interesting once again because Mara arrives at the information independently, from the perspective of a Gentile Stoic philosopher who has no incentive to promote Christianity. Instead, he treats Jesus as a historical figure whose fate was already widely known and who was, even from such an early stage, being lumped together with the likes of Socrates and Pythagoras, renowned figures from centuries earlier. This tells us that, from very early on, Jesus was already being regarded as a wise moral teacher whose influences had outlived his execution, with his teachings being well known well beyond Judea. This undercuts any notion that Jesus was a marginal peasant whose importance was invented later on, or that he was a figure unknown outside Christian propaganda. Instead, Mara presents Jesus as someone whose influence was global enough to be a philosophical example of God vindicating the wise. More relevant to our present discussion, it shows us that, from very early on, it was widely known that the Jewish people had executed their so-called wise king, and as a result, had lost their kingdom. Perhaps my favorite non-Christian source about the death of Jesus, however, comes from the Jewish people themselves in the text of the Talmud. This text is interesting specifically because it is the one text which attributes a different method of execution to the death of Jesus, but there's good historical reasoning for the misunderstanding. In Sanhedrin 43a of the Babylonian Talmud, likely composed somewhere during the 4th and 5th centuries, we read the following. The Gemara, a section of the Talmud, raises a difficulty, but it isn't taught in a Baraita, which is to say in the oral tradition from the 1st to 3rd centuries. On Passover Eve, they hung the corpse of Jesus the Nazarene after they killed him by way of stoning. And a crier went out before him for 40 days, publicly proclaiming, Jesus the Nazarene is going out to be stoned because he practiced sorcery, incited people to idol worship, and led the Jewish people astray. Anyone who knows of a person to acquit him should come forward and teach it on his behalf. And the court did not find a reason to acquit him, and so they stoned him and hung his corpse on Passover Eve. This passage is significant for several reasons. For one, while it was likely written during the 4th or 5th century CE, it claims to be reporting an oral tradition which dated much earlier. And that oral tradition gives us several very important details. Firstly, it tells us that Jesus was well known as the Nazarene. Secondly, it tells us that he was executed by the Jewish people. Thirdly, it tells us that he was executed on the eve of Passover. Fourthly, it tells us that he was charged with 3 crimes: sorcery, idol worship, and leading the people astray. Fifthly, it tells us that he was stoned to death. Sixthly, it tells us that after being stoned to death, his corpse was hung. The reason this is significant is manifold. On one hand, the first 3 of these details align perfectly with Scripture. Jesus being called a Nazarene, Jesus being executed by the Jewish people, and Jesus being executed on the eve of Passover. And it makes perfect sense why these would align. Firstly, Jewish people obviously wouldn't call Jesus the Christ since they didn't believe that he was the Christ. However, since Jesus was a very common name, it makes sense that they would identify him as Jesus the Nazarene, since that was a far less common and more specific title, especially given how small Nazareth was. Secondly, since Jesus was, from their perspective, a Jewish criminal and false prophet, it only makes sense that they would recognize that it was their own people who were responsible for putting him to death. Thirdly, since it was heavily frowned upon to have capital trials on the eve of major Jewish feast days, Jesus' execution during Passover would have been something that stuck to the cultural memory. So it makes sense why all these details would align. However, the differences actually make sense as well, and this is, in my opinion, where things get quite exciting from a historiographical perspective. Jesus being charged with the crimes of sorcery, idol worship, and leading the people astray makes perfect sense, because this is simply the gospel told from the perspective of the anti-Christian Jews. Even in the Gospels, we see Pharisees responding to Jesus' miracles, his claims about himself, and his movement by accusing him of sorcery, blasphemy, and false prophecy. So this is just several centuries evolution of the same line of thought. As for the 5th and 6th details, Jesus' corpse being hung up only after he was stoned to death, this makes sense if you consider the fact that this is a 4th or 5th century Jew trying to make sense of an oral tradition that had been passed down for centuries. It would seem that, according to the tradition, it was well known that Jesus had been hung from a tree. However, crucifixion was a Roman mode of execution, not a Jewish one. Stoning is the only legitimate Jewish method of capital punishment under Torah, and so it's reasonable to assume that a 4th or 5th century Jew, recognizing that his own people had been the ones to sentence Jesus to death, would have done so by stoning. However, since the tradition was that Jesus had been hung, the next reasonable conclusion that the person would make is that he was stoned to death only for his corpse to be hung up at a later time. The thing that makes this all the neater, and the reason why I love this particular passage so much, is because a little earlier in the same book of the Talmud, the author mentions that the Sanhedrin ceased judging cases of capital law 40 years before the destruction of the temple. Since the temple was destroyed in 70 CE, this means that there was a 40-year window from 30 to 70 CE wherein the Sanhedrin right to capital trials was taken away by the Romans. The first 7 of these years, from 30 to 36 CE, would have fallen during the time period of Pontius Pilate, which several sources already have placed as the time period during which Jesus was crucified. It's reasonable to conceive that a Jew centuries after the time of Jesus didn't know that he was executed during that short window of time wherein the Sanhedrin didn't have the right to capital punishment, especially when, by their own report, they are adding commentary on a Baraita, an oral tradition that had been passed down for centuries. The misunderstanding can be attributed to the fact that the Talmudic author misunderstood Jesus' execution to be a legal, Torah-based execution, not a Roman one. Moreover, this would actually seem to align with John chapter 18, verse 31, wherein the Jews, responding to Pilate's attempt to have them judge Jesus by their own law, remarked to Pilate that it is not lawful for us to put anyone to death. Without explicitly stating it, John is placing Jesus' death during that same time window reflected by the Talmud, a time period coinciding with the prefect Pontius Pilate, wherein the Jewish right to a capital punishment had been stripped away. Even if all of this theorizing were incorrect, however, the point remains the same. Even according to the Jewish people themselves, they had Jesus of Nazareth executed on the eve of Passover. Sure, they might not say by crucifixion, but this is still a non-Christian source attesting to the execution of Jesus, and there are good historical reasons to account for any sort of misunderstanding. That being said, let us now turn our attention to the Christian sources attesting to the death of Jesus. And it goes without saying that Christian sources make so many references to the death of Jesus, and moreover to his death by crucifixion, that it would take way too much time to go through every single one of them. In the New Testament alone, Jesus' death is a central subject and focus. And remember, all because the New Testament documents have a pro-Christian bias doesn't mean that they shouldn't be treated as historical witnesses. You don't have to be a Christian to appreciate the value of the New Testament documents themselves, which not only serve as our primary source about Jesus in the early church, but also about Judaism in the first century outside the works of Josephus. The New Testament was completed by the end of the first century, and it is absolutely filled with information about the death of Jesus. While we can't know with any sort of hardline specificity the date when the 4 Gospels were composed, other than the fact that they were composed during the first century, we have good reason to believe that many of Paul's epistles were written before them, and he mentions the death of Jesus quite a lot, either directly through the mention of his blood, his sacrifice, or his death on a cross, or indirectly through mention of his resurrection, which is only significant if he died beforehand. It is Paul who famously declared in Romans chapter 5, verse 8, that God demonstrates his own love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Or in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 3, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures. Or in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 14, that if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep in Jesus. But Paul doesn't stop at mentioning Jesus' death. He repeatedly mentions Jesus' death on a cross. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 23, he said that we preach Christ crucified, to Jews a stumbling block, and to Gentiles foolishness. In Galatians chapter 2, verse 20, he said that I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And these are but a few examples. It is evident that to Paul, Jesus of Nazareth died on a cross. When we turn to the Gospels, of course, we're provided with our most in-depth narratives concerning Christ's crucifixion and his death. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John portrayed Jesus as being betrayed by Judas Iscariot in the Garden of Gethsemane before facing a series of nighttime trials at the hands of the Jews before being handed over to Pontius Pilate and sentenced to death on Friday morning, shortly before the Passover. After several hours on the cross, Jesus cries out with a loud voice and dies, at which point he was lowered from the cross before sundown and buried in a tomb belonging to a man named Joseph of Arimathea. Again, even if you don't acknowledge the Bible as the inspired word of God, these are our earliest and most detailed records of the life and death of Jesus of Nazareth. And other New Testament documents mention Jesus' death as well. The book of Hebrews describes Jesus as being crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death that he endured, and devotes a good portion of chapters 9 and 10 to explaining how Jesus' death brought about the new covenant. Likewise, 1 Peter makes several references to Jesus' resurrection from the dead and says that Jesus himself bore our sins in his body on the tree so that having died to sin, we might live to righteousness. It is evident that, to the authors of the New Testament, Jesus of Nazareth clearly died a death by crucifixion. But it does not stop there. When we turn to the non-canonical literature, we also see that Jesus' death is multiply attested. This is especially true in the Apostolic Fathers, some of the earliest non-canonical Christian texts to which we have access. In Ignatius' letter to the Ephesians, he rebukes those who corrupt by wicked doctrine the faith of God, for which Jesus Christ was crucified. The Epistle of Barnabas describes Jesus being fixed to the cross and being offered vinegar and gall. The martyrdom of Polycarp mentions how one man wanted to dispose of Polycarp's body, lest, forsaking him that was crucified, the Christians begin to worship Polycarp instead, to which the author adds that it would be impossible for them to forsake Christ, who suffered for the salvation of such as shall be saved throughout the whole world. Again, more examples could be cited, but the point is made. To the Apostolic Fathers, Christ evidently died a death by crucifixion. So too in other non-canonical literature. While some of these documents were denounced as heresy by the early church, they nevertheless attest to the fact that it was universally recognized that Jesus died a death by crucifixion. The Gospel of the Hebrews mentions Jesus' bodily resurrection, which by implication necessitates his death. The Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Truth mention his death, while the Gospel of the Savior gets even more specific by mentioning his crucifixion. Similarly, the Gnostic Coptic Apocalypse of Peter and the second treatise of the Great Seth depict Jesus' crucifixion and death. Not only does the Gospel of Peter provide a detailed account of Jesus' death, but in a very strange account of his resurrection, the cross actually follows Jesus out of the tomb and verbally responds to a question asked by God. While that story is obviously very strange, fantastical, and historically very, very improbable, it nevertheless confirms, as with all the rest of our evidence, that Christ's death by crucifixion was multiply attested in both Christian, non-Christian, and pseudo-Christian sources. In addition to this, we must add yet another fact. There is no ancient evidence to the contrary. While there are fringe conspiracy theorists who will assert that Jesus did not die on the cross or that somebody died in his place, such people are basing their conspiracy on absolutely zero historical evidence. There are no ancient historical witnesses that suggest Jesus died a peaceful death at an old age, nor are there any historical witnesses that attest to him dying a death by anything but crucifixion. The one exception to this is the death by stoning in the Talmud, but like we already pointed out, that witness dates far, far later than any of the other ones previously considered. And even then, there is actually good explanation for the misattribution. As it stands, we have multiple witnesses, Christian and non-Christian alike, that would place Jesus of Nazareth as being crucified in Judea at the hands of the Jews who delivered him over to Pontius Pilate. This is multiply attested. And this in turn brings us to our second piece of evidence. Not only do we have multiple attestations to Jesus' crucifixion, but we also have very early attestation to the crucifixion of Jesus. In other words, in addition to the sheer quantity of ancient reports we have concerning Jesus' crucifixion, many of those reports are very, very early. Even amongst the non-Christian sources that we have looked at, some of the attestations come to us from the late 1st century, reports such as that of Mara bar Serapion or Josephus. However, whenever you consider the witnesses of the New Testament themselves, we can push our attestations as being far, far earlier. And once again, I feel like I'm beating a dead horse at this point. We must remember that you needn't adhere to the Bible as the Word of God to value the documents themselves as crucial historical witnesses. Moreover, we must remember that the New Testament is not a single document, but 27 separate documents that have been collated into the New Testament collection as we currently know it. As such, the New Testament alone, the entirety of which had been written by the end of the 1st century, provides us with 27 of our earliest historical witnesses to the life of Jesus and the beliefs of the early Jesus movement. Assuming that, in accordance with the plethora of historical records, Jesus was crucified during the time of Pontius Pilate in the early 30s CE, this means that the latest New Testament document was written within 70 years at the latest of the events themselves. However, some of Paul's letters were written within 2 decades of the event, and as we will see momentarily, there is content within those letters which we can confidently trace to even sooner before that. Moreover, while it is far from the majority position, there are some scholars who argue that the Gospels themselves, Matthew and Mark in particular, could have been written far earlier than is generally supposed, though that is another argument for another time. For right now, it is simply worth mentioning that the New Testament provides us with 27 historical witnesses to Jesus from within the first century. And as we already mentioned when examining the first piece of evidence, several of these documents explicitly or implicitly mention the death or cross of Jesus. But we can get even more specific than that. When we look to Paul's epistles alone, we see that Paul mentions Jesus' death by crucifixion no later than 55 CE, which is typically regarded as the latest possible date for the composition of Galatians and 1 Corinthians, though it's possible that Galatians was written as early as 48 CE. In the opening verse of Galatians, Paul identifies himself as Paul, an apostle, sent not from men nor through man, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him from the dead. Throughout the remainder of the letter, which once again was written within 20 to 25 years of Christ's reported execution, Paul makes no less than 5 explicit references to the death and crucifixion of Christ. In one instance, he goes so far as to rebuke his audience by saying, "O foolish Galatians, who bewitched you, before whose eyes Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified?" In this instance, Paul is not suggesting that the entire Galatian congregation were physically present at the crucifixion of Jesus, but rather that during his time ministering to them, Paul's preaching made the crucifixion of Jesus inescapably clear, painting a vivid portrait for all of them to grasp. The time of this preaching obviously predates the composition of the letter and likely would have been during his first missionary journey sometime around 47 to 48 CE, a time during which, according to the book of Acts, Paul reportedly planted many churches in the region of Galatia. We can follow the same logic in 1 Corinthians, where Paul makes no less than 12 explicit or implicit references to Jesus' death or crucifixion, while devoting an entire section, chapter 15, to the topic of Christ's resurrection. It is within this section that we find one of the most crucial verses from a historical perspective. In this verse, which we have quoted several times over the course of this study already, and which we will look at much more in depth at a later time, Paul says to the Corinthians, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. And after that he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. After that he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me also." It is the beginning of this quote that draws our present attention. Writing sometime between 54 and 55 CE, Paul says that he delivered to the Corinthians something which he describes as being of first importance. Most historians conclude that this is a reference to Paul's planting of the Corinthian church, which various historical details in the book of Acts allow us to safely date sometime between 50 and 51 CE, when Paul remained with the Corinthians for a year and a half. Thus we can say that, as early as 51 CE at the latest, Paul proclaimed the atoning death of Jesus as a matter of first importance to the Corinthian church. But it doesn't stop there. Paul doesn't claim to have come up with the doctrine which he delivered to the Corinthians. Rather, he says that I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received. A linguistic analysis of the remainder of Paul's quote has led practically all scholars to believe that everything he says afterwards about Jesus dying, being buried, rising on the third day, and appearing to many is an example of early church kerygma, a proclamation or oral formula declaring Christ's death and resurrection, and, more importantly to our present discussion, something that is not original to Paul. As such, most scholars hold that this kerygma is not Paul's own invention, but is representative of that which he received and subsequently passed down to the Corinthians. In other words, this is a fixed formula that Paul inherited, not a doctrine that Paul composed. The natural question that arises is, from where did Paul receive it? And once again, an analysis of the creed itself suggests an early Jerusalem setting, where the 12 apostles are treated as a unified group. This suggests that it was formulated very early on in church history, prior to the scattering of the apostles, which most people date to around 44 CE. Moreover, since Paul passed this creed down to the Corinthians as something of first importance, it only follows that he received it as something of first importance, which means that it was a tradition handed to him by the apostles themselves. It just so happens that the book of Acts and Galatians separately record that, sometime after his Damascus Road experience, Paul went down to Jerusalem to meet with Peter and James. This meeting in Jerusalem, which took place somewhere between 35 and 37 CE, is the most common scholarly location for the time wherein Paul received and verified the resurrection tradition that he's passing to the Corinthians. As such, it is safe to date this particular kerygma to sometime between 35 and 37 CE, within 2 to 7 years of Christ's reported crucifixion, depending on whether one adheres to the 30 or 33 CE date. Moreover, pointing out that it's doubtful that Paul happened to receive this tradition from the apostles on the very date that it was formulated, some scholars have convincingly argued that this formula could date to within months of Jesus' death. But at that point, we're merely engaging in guesswork, and so for the sake of being conservative, let's just say that it dates to within a few years of Christ's reported death. Long story short, most scholars, both liberal and conservative alike, date the kerygma of 1 Corinthians 15 to within a few years, and by some estimations, a few months of Jesus' actual death, which would suggest that we have extremely early attestation of Christ's death. There are other similar oral formulas found littered throughout the New Testament, but that found in 1 Corinthians 15 is easily the most useful because it dates so early. For this reason, we will return to it in greater detail at a later point in our study. Long story short, not only do we have multiple witnesses attesting to the death and crucifixion of Jesus, but we have many early witnesses attesting to the death and crucifixion of Jesus. The 27-document New Testament corpus was composed within 70 years at the latest, with a greater majority of those books being penned within 40 years, and several being composed within 20 years. Depending on how one dates the Gospels, it is possible that Matthew or Mark were written at an even earlier date, and the oral formula found in 1 Corinthians dates to within years or even months of the crucifixion itself. For a historian, this is a treasure trove of information. This leads to our third piece of evidence: credible attestation. Not only do we have many witnesses, and not only do we have early witnesses, but when you examine the passion narratives as they are found in the four Gospels themselves, there are details found within these narratives which give scholars good reason to believe that they are reporting accurately. As Licona puts it, a third evidence of Jesus' death by crucifixion is that the passion narratives appear largely credible given their satisfying of the criterion of embarrassment and the plausibility of certain peripheral details. There are two things that Licona draws attention to: the criterion of embarrassment and peripheral details. We will turn to the matter of peripheral details in a moment, but let us take a brief aside to explain what the criterion of embarrassment is, as it will come into play a lot as we go deeper into this study. To put it simply, the criterion of embarrassment is one of the criterion of authenticity, alongside things such as the criterion of multiple independent reports or the criterion of dissimilarity, which historians employ to help demonstrate the historical plausibility and probability of an event. In particular, the criterion of embarrassment asserts that a historical account is more likely to be true when featuring events or details which are negative or embarrassing to the author or the agenda that they are trying to promote, because it is less likely for an author to invent a historical account which might embarrass them or their movement. For example, if a former president of the United States admits that he intentionally ignored an intelligence brief because he didn't want to deal with it, there's a good chance that he is reporting the truth, because it makes him look negligent, it gives ammunition to the critics, and it serves no obvious propaganda purpose. In the same way, if a famous athlete admits to cheating on a spouse, losing control due to drug addiction, or being benched for poor performance, these are deemed more likely to be true because these details run the risk of destroying their brand image or harming endorsement opportunities, offering no narrative advantage beyond reporting the truth. By contrast, if I were to tell you that I was, for a short while, the Texas State karate champion, that could be true, but one could also perceive why I might fabricate such a story. At the same time, we must recognize that the human heart is a complex thing, and sometimes people will fake embarrassing details for reasons imperceivable to the modern historian. For this reason, the criterion of embarrassment doesn't by itself prove that something is historical, but it does point us in that direction. Insofar as the passion narratives and the Gospels are concerned, there are abundant examples of the criterion of embarrassment at work. The most obvious of these is the fact that all four Gospel accounts willfully portray the Messianic king and founder of the Christian movement being rejected by the Jewish people, stripped naked, and sentenced as a criminal to the most humiliating and shameful death of that time. Whenever you add to this the fact that the evangelists believed their Messiah figure to be God incarnate, the creator of the universe, this story becomes even more embarrassing. However, one could easily counter this argument by pointing out that the story does not end in Jesus' death, and so it isn't exactly embarrassing to paint God incarnate as conquering death once and for all. Granting that argument, let's turn our attention instead to how the evangelists depict Jesus as he approaches his death. When you look at other contemporary accounts of people being martyred for their faith, the martyrs are usually depicted as bravely enduring their torture and execution as if it were nothing. In 2 Maccabees chapter 7, we read an account of a mother and her 7 sons being executed for their faith. As the first of the sons lays there dying, the text tells us that those who remained there encouraged one another to die bravely, breaking out into song. One by one, they courageously offer themselves over to death, each offering a powerful speech before being cut off from the land of the living. Similarly, 4th Maccabees details the torture and death of an old man named Eleazar. The text tells us that even as he was tortured, Eleazar was dignified and generous, keeping his eyes raised toward heaven while the whips tore into his flesh, ripped his sides, and made his blood flow. As such, we read that he amazed even the torturers with his courage, and that he began to preach even as he was being carried to the fire. Even once he was burned down to his bones and near the point of death, Eleazar raises his eyes to God and says, "God, you know that I could have saved myself. Instead, I am being burned and tortured to death for the sake of your law." He asks God to purify the Jewish people by his sacrifice and dies with dignity from the torture. This can be compared again to Stephen's martyrdom in the book of Acts, where the young man sets his eyes on heaven and sees Jesus standing at the right hand of God. Even as he is being pelted by stones, Stephen falls to his knees and cries out, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them," dying with dignity on his lips. In the same vein, both the Jewish Talmud and the Christian Apostolic Fathers trend towards painting martyrs in a heroic and valiant light, stripping them of any weakness and allowing them to suffer without any sign of buckling under pressure. This isn't to suggest, mind you, that these accounts are fabricating their stories, and that it isn't hard to see that there's ample room for embellishment. These martyrdom accounts make these people look good. Contrast this with how the Gospels depict Jesus. Matthew, Mark, and Luke in particular go out of their way to emphasize Jesus' weakness in face of his looming death. Whenever you compare the gospel accounts to these others that we just examined, it's almost as if the evangelists were intentionally trying to make Jesus look less valiant, which is surprising given that they viewed Jesus not only as a prophet and not only as a king, but as God in the flesh. This is even crazier whenever you consider that each of these gospels likewise portrays Jesus as knowing that this day of suffering was coming way ahead of time. On at least 3 separate occasions in each of their narratives, Jesus has predicted that when he arrived in Jerusalem, he would be betrayed and handed over to crucifixion. In spite of this, when the moment of betrayal comes, Jesus tells his disciples, "My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch with me." Then, falling upon his face, he prays to God, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." Far from approaching his death with dignity and valiance, Jesus begs God for some way, any way, to avoid his impending death. Luke describes his sweat as being like drops of blood, so deep is his anxiety in these moments. And ultimately, the true testimony of Jesus' character is the fact that he goes through with the sacrifice in spite of his reservation and in spite of his tremendous fear. But the fact that the evangelists depicted these reservations and fear at all fits the criterion of embarrassment, and as such rings with historical authenticity. There is no clear reason why the evangelists would go out of their way to frame the hero of the story, who once again they believe to be the creator of the universe, in such a state of immense weakness, unless the events that they're describing actually happened. From the perspective of a historian, this would suggest that there is truth behind the narratives that they are detailing. And it doesn't stop there. As Licona points out, in addition to satisfying the criterion of embarrassment, there are also a number of details in the canonical Gospels pertaining to Jesus' execution that possess plausibility, although these details are in the peripherals of the story. Further, he acknowledges that although one peripheral detail is not strong evidence when considered in isolation, the plausibility of numerous details in the reports possess weight when considered in light of the other evidences weighing in favor of historicity. In other words, these peripheral details found in the Passion accounts are icing on the cake. Not only do we have multiple witnesses, and not only do we have early witnesses, and not only does the criterion of embarrassment give us confidence in the credibility of some of these early witnesses, but so too these peripheral details give us good reason to believe that the evangelists were reporting authentic historical information. For example, in the Passing of Peregrinus, the 2nd century work of satire that we mentioned a little while ago, the author Lucian mentions that, as Peregrinus marched to his death to burn himself at the stake, he was accompanied by a great crowd of people. Lucian snidely remarks that as he was being escorted by the crowds, Peregrinus was getting his fill of glory as he gazed at the number of his admirers, not knowing, poor wretch, that men on their way to the cross or in the grip of the executioner have many more at their heels. Apparently, it was commonplace, according to Lucian, for great crowds to follow criminals to the site of their execution. The reason this is significant is because in Luke's gospel, as Jesus makes his way to Golgotha, Luke casually mentions that following him was a large multitude of the people, and of women who were mourning and lamenting him. The reason this is significant is precisely because of how insignificant it is. It exists in the periphery of the story without contributing anything major to the narrative as a whole. Luke does not explain or justify why the crowd was there, nor does he use the presence of the crowd to make a theological point of any kind. Instead, he simply assumes the presence of a crowd as being normal to Roman executions. In other words, Luke's account fits the ordinary social reality of Roman executions in a manner that a later legendary story would have no reason or need to invent. It reflects a memory recalled by an eyewitness, not a story or a legend fabricated long after the fact. One could argue that this is coincidental, or perhaps that Luke inserted that detail specifically to give his narrative the appearance of credibility, but the Passion narratives are filled with peripheral details such as these. To prove this, let's look at several found in a few short verses in the Gospel of John. In the 1st century BCE, the philosopher and orator Cicero produced a series of philippics, which is to say, a damning speech intended to condemn a politician, primarily directed against Mark Antony sometime around 44 to 43 BCE. In one of these speeches, he begins to target Titus Plancus, a man that he describes as being so shameful that people have developed a proverb about him, declaring that it is quite impossible for him to die unless his legs are broken, yet even when they are broken, still he lives. While Cicero doesn't explicitly mention crucifixion here, the general consensus by historians is that Cicero is referencing crurifragium, the Roman practice of shattering the legs of crucifixion victims in order to hasten their death by causing them to suffocate. Similarly, the 2nd century CE non-canonical Gospel of Peter mentions how the guards, frustrated by one of the thieves mocking Christ, ordered that there be no leg breaking so that he might die tormented. Furthermore, as recently as 1968, a group of archaeologists in Jerusalem discovered the remains of Yohanan ben Hagakal, a crucified victim from the 1st century CE, which is to say, a man who had been crucified in the same city during the same century as Jesus. While this discovery was monumental in informing us about 1st century crucifixion, most relevant to our present discussion is that the victim's shin had been shattered, suggesting that he had been subjected to crurifragium. All these details are relevant because in John's Gospel, the Jews ask Pilate to break the legs of the crucified victims, something which he instructs the guards to do. The reason this is significant is because John doesn't bother to explain the mechanics of crucifixion, nor the reason why the Jews would want the legs to be broken to begin with. Most importantly, he doesn't specify that breaking the legs was intended to speed up death. He simply mentions that they asked for the legs to be broken because it was the day of preparation, without explaining what those two details have to do with one another. In other words, it doesn't give off the impression of someone who is fabricating a story to tell an audience, but someone who is recalling actual eyewitness details that presuppose a well-known Roman execution procedure. The detail appears only when it becomes relevant in the moment, with little to no explanation offered to explain the actions being performed. Moreover, like Luke's detail concerning the crowds, John isn't proving a dramatic theological point. He's simply detailing what happened. Again, this detail doesn't by itself prove historical authenticity, but it does add further evidence against intentional fabrication. A third example comes from this same passage in the Gospel of John. In it, John explains that the Jews wanted the legs broken so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath. In short, they wanted the legs to be broken so that the deaths could be quickened and so that the bodies could be buried, not only because it was the Sabbath and not only because it was a Passover, but also because of the Deuteronomic prohibition against allowing a corpse to hang all night on a tree in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 23. John, mind you, doesn't explain any of this, so one could just as easily point out that John's lack of an explanation here also serves as a peripheral detail favoring authenticity. However, our present point actually goes a bit more in depth, and it revolves around the question of power. What makes the Jewish people think that they would be granted such a request? It is the Romans, not the Jews, who were in power, so what makes the priests think that Pilate would grant them the request to have these bodies taken down early? It is well known that crucifixion was intended to be a prolonged act of torture which brought shame upon the victim and their family and scared the masses into submission. Given this information, advanced by the fact that removing a body from a cross is a cumbersome task, it was usually advantageous to the Romans to leave crucified victims on the cross as long as possible. As such, Romans often left crucified victims on crosses for a while after their death, leaving them to be food for the animals. That's why archaeologists have found so few remains of crucified victims, because most people who were crucified were not given burials. Their bodies were left on the crosses to be eaten by the wild beasts. The 1st century BCE poet Horace reflects on this when he speaks of a person hanging on a cross and feeding crows. Similarly, in the 1st century CE, philosopher Plutarch's work, The Life of Cleomenes, upon King Cleomenes' death, his body is flayed and hung up, and it remained hung up for several days. Once again, this would suggest that there wasn't a tendency to have hanging bodies removed at haste. Reflective of this same point, in the 1st century CE, the Roman poet Juvenal wrote a satire critiquing Roman families for obsessing over how their houses looked on the inside, while at the same time failing to care about how their children looked on the inside. He argues that you are what you eat, and that what you feed your children is what they will ultimately become. He says that the vulture flies to its young, bringing pieces of carrion, morsels from dead cattle or dogs, or from crucifixions. Apparently, it was commonplace in the 1st century Roman Empire for vultures to be seen eating the dead carcasses of crucified victims. As still one final example, the 1st century CE courtier Petronius tells a satirical story about a woman from Ephesus renowned for extreme marital fidelity who is mourning her husband from within his tomb. Meanwhile, a soldier guarding dead bodies on a cross overhears her crying, approaches her, and persuades her to eat, live, and eventually become his lover, enjoying a multi-day long rendezvous in the tomb of her deceased husband, time during which family members of a crucified victim steal and bury the body of their loved one. Realizing his dereliction of duty could cost her lover his life, the woman saves him by having her husband's corpse hung on the vacant cross. The story is obviously quite silly, but the historical backdrop is quite telling. Once again, we see that it was commonplace for bodies to be hung from a cross for days after death, and to remove a body prematurely was no small offense. A person could be killed for it. I cite all these examples to prove a single point. The Romans weren't in a rush to take down crucified victims. In fact, it was advantageous to them to leave the bodies up as long as possible, because the longer the body was up, the longer the message was sent. Don't mess with Rome. So when the Jews approach Pilate asking for the body to be taken down early, one might be tempted to scoff at the notion that a Roman prefect would grant such a request. And then when Pilate does grant the request, one might be tempted to think that John is making the story up, because it all seems so unrealistic. Until you account for Josephus, that is. Josephus, the 1st century historian that we talked about earlier, actually manages to provide us with the solution. Writing near the end of the 1st century, Josephus recalls an event around 67 CE wherein Idumeans desecrated Jewish bodies in Jerusalem by denying them proper burials. He further explains that, prior to this event, the Jews used to take so much care of the burial of men that they took down those that were condemned and crucified and buried them before the going down of the sun. This tells us that the Romans did seem to make an exception for the sake of Jews in Jerusalem, allowing them to remove crucified bodies before sunset, probably out of a desire to keep the peace by honoring their religious convictions. Not only does this harmonize well with John's account, but it does so in a peripheral manner that adds further credibility to John's account. Once again, John does not mention that Romans typically kept the bodies on the cross for days, nor does he mention that Jerusalem was a seeming exception to this rule. Instead, he just matter-of-factly mentions that Pilate granted the Jews' request, and it is external historical resources that help corroborate why that request was granted. A fourth example of a peripheral detail appears in the immediate aftermath of the leg-breaking incident. The soldiers, perceiving that Jesus was already dead, resolved not to break his legs, but to pierce his side instead. Even without being familiar with Roman customs, it's easy to see why they do this. If breaking a person's legs hastens their death, there's no point in breaking the legs of someone who is already dead to begin with. However, to confirm his death, they might pierce his side, and his lack of reaction, accompanied by the trauma of the puncture wound, will confirm that he is, in fact, dead and ready for burial. Like I said, you don't have to be familiar with Roman practices to understand why they might do this, but the cool thing is that we have external evidence corroborating the fact that this was, in fact, a Roman practice. In a Latin text known as the Declamationes Maiores, or Major Declarations, the author declares, "As for those who die on the cross, the executioner does not forbid the burying of those who have been pierced." In other words, piercing the body of a crucified victim was a sign that the body was dead and ready to be buried. Once again, John does not defend this practice, nor overtly explain the purpose of it. He just mentions it in the periphery, and history backs it up. This leans us in favor, once again, of historical credibility. Our final example is quite a bit different from the rest, but it has to deal with the same exact passage in John's Gospel. Over the course of John's Passion narrative, he cites 3 different events as fulfillments of prophecy. First, he associates the guards casting lots for Jesus' garments as a fulfillment of Psalm chapter 22, verse 18. "They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." Second, he associates Jesus' legs not being broken with Psalm chapter 34, verse 20. "He keeps all his bones, and not one of them is broken." Thirdly, he associates Jesus being pierced with Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10, "So that they will look on me whom they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only son, and they will weep bitterly over him like the bitter weeping over a firstborn." It isn't uncommon for skeptics to accuse the Jesus story of being the product of legendary development, with the evangelist fabricating details of Jesus' life to make it correspond with prophecies about the Messiah. This, they suggest, is why the evangelists present Jesus as being descended from David, born in Bethlehem, and entering into Jerusalem on a donkey. Those who are more conspiratorial in their inclination will suggest that the early church retroactively added these details into Jesus' life in order to add credibility to his movement. And this is precisely why these 3 prophecies are so significant. In the examples previously listed, one can understand why a skeptic might be skeptical. It was well known that the Messiah needed to be a son of David who was born in Bethlehem and who one day rode into Jerusalem on a donkey. So if someone were so inclined to fabricate a story about the supposed Messiah, these attributes could hardly be omitted from the account. What's interesting about these 3 prophecies cited in John chapter 19, however, is that prior to the Gospel of John, we have no evidence of Psalm 22, Psalm 34, or Zechariah 12 being associated with the Messiah whatsoever. We don't read Jewish people of the intertestamental time period speculating that the Messiah's garments will be gambled over. No one prior to the Gospel of John asserts that the Messiah's bones could not be broken. And when you read Zechariah chapter 12 in its original context, the passage seems like it is talking about God, not the Messiah. And prior to Jesus, it didn't seem like anyone expected the Messiah to be God in the flesh. My point is this: if John's account of the crucifixion were purely inventive, then he would have to identify random passages in Scripture that weren't messianic at all, forge a sequence of events that match these passages exactly, and subsequently ensure that his fabricated account read as natural and historically plausible as possible. Not only would this be incredibly difficult, but we would also have to realize that John gains absolutely nothing by fabricating these events as fulfillments of prophecy. After all, if all the overtly messianic prophecies haven't convinced people so far, then these 3 certainly won't, and so John would be fabricating this entire sequence of events for no reason whatsoever. To put it simply, it's far easier to believe that John historically witnessed the events and only later saw the scriptural connections, than that he invented the details to match obscure texts that no one had ever applied messianically, if that makes sense. This conclusion is strengthened by the fact that casting lots for clothing, breaking the legs of criminals, and piercing the corpses of crucified victims are all historically authenticated practices of Roman soldiers during crucifixions, things which we know from external sources that they did have a practice of doing. These are all things that John would have witnessed if he were physically present at an actual crucifixion, and as such, the presence of these prophecy quotations lends towards the fact that his account of the crucifixion is rooted in historical fact. Keep in mind that I am not presently arguing that this proves Jesus is the Messiah. Instead, I am simply pointing out that the only conceivable way that John would have come to associate such random passages of Scripture with Jesus is if Jesus had, in fact, been crucified. And moreover, if his garments had been gambled over, his legs had not been broken, and his side had been pierced. It doesn't undeniably prove that he is the Messiah, but from a historian's perspective, it does suggest that John is, at the very least, documenting a historical event which actually happened. Like I said from the beginning, none of these peripheral details in and of themselves are enough to render the event undeniable historical fact. Some hold different weight than others, and some historians will value different ones to different degrees. However, when you consider all of these details together, along with the criterion of embarrassment elements that we addressed before, overall the four Gospels bear evidence of being highly credible in their account of the crucifixion. This is not to assert that every single thing in the Gospels is historical fact. That is subject for further inquiry as we continue our study, but rather that all things considered, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John demonstrate significant evidence of being credible witnesses attesting to key details revolving around the crucifixion of Jesus, namely his agony in the Garden of Gethsemane, his sentencing under Pontius Pilate, the crowds following him to the place of crucifixion, the guards gambling for his clothing, the legs of the thieves being broken, Jesus' side being pierced, and the removal and burial of all the bodies before sundown on the Sabbath. In these details, we have good historiographical reason to believe that the Gospels are reporting accurate historical information. And this brings us to the end of our third evidence for the crucifixion of Jesus. To summarize, we have good reason for considering the crucifixion of Jesus a historical fact. Firstly, we have a great quantity of Christian and non-Christian sources attesting to his crucifixion. Secondly, many of these sources are very early, dating within decades or even years of the event. Thirdly, various details within the passion narratives of the four Gospels point toward their credibility in documenting the events themselves, giving us reason to believe that Jesus was indeed crucified. There is, however, still one more piece of evidence that we need to look at, and that's what we're going to do next, so I will see y'all then.